Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Piano 101 podcast with me, Fran Wilson, the cross-eyed pianist, and my good friend Dr. Michael Lowe, a pianist and teacher based in South Africa. Well, good afternoon, Michael. Great to see you again for another podcast. Today we thought we'd talk about great pianists of the past, and in particular some of the dead pianists whom we admire. I have to admit that I don't listen to many recordings of pianists of the past, but I'm interested in your views on why we should be listening to their recordings, why we should seek out what they've done and what we can learn from these people and their performances. So I think we'll maybe kick off. If you perhaps let me know some of your favourite pianists of the past and what you admire about them.
Well, I remember when you mentioned this podcast, Fran, I actually went and sat down and I made a list of my top, sort of like 10 pianists that's no longer alive. And for the life of me, I actually can't remember who I actually put on that list, to be honest. But I can tell you now that all of them have one thing that is different from the pianists of today. Is that the first thing is that, and you're going to laugh when I say this, and I think it's very true, is that they actually don't care how they look like on social media. That's the thing. And it's true. I mean, they don't play the piano to get views and to get hits and to get likes and for instantaneous gratification. They play for the music. And in time with that is that, a lot of these pianists knows how to read the score. And when I say read the score, I don't mean just play the notes. They read the score in a very profound sense of way. What does piano mean? What does crescendo means? What does it come in context of what happens in the piece? It's no longer, everything's not just objective, that's how I see it. They also have one incredible sense of musical direction in their playing and being able to layer sound colors. And of course, technically, it's all, they're very efficient in the sense that they have a very, I don't want to say profound technique, a very facile technique. Look at someone like Horowitz and Rubinstein, to name two of the no longer a live pianist. Economy of movements, playing like that, and of course, last but not least, enormous personality that they have, what they bring into the music, whilst at the same time respecting the musical score. I think all that are, and I'm sad to say, I don't want to sound like sort of a pessimist. Something that these sort of stuff are not, unfortunately, are not translated as well as they could be to a later generation, in the new generation of pianists, because a lot of the new generation of pianists that I see on social media are just pandering to what the audience wants to see. They play the piano and they look very good when they play the piano, or they look very stylish, whatever. But beneath, if you take away, scratch a bit of the surface, what goes underneath, the performance, there isn't really that much thought that goes behind what they're doing. But that might seem harsh, but that's just my opinion.
I think that's very interesting, and something I think I've noticed from listening to earlier recordings, that there's a greater sense of freedom, which I think comes from the fact that there were fewer recordings available as benchmarks, and I think there was just a more liberated attitude to performance. There's a very interesting book which you might know by Kenneth Hamilton, who's an academic and pianist, which I think is called The Golden Age of Pianism, or Pianists of the Golden Age. So he touches on some of the pianists you've mentioned and some even earlier, where there are very, very early recordings. And, you listen to these and find much greater flexibility. Also, this slight dislocation between the hands, which now would be considered absolutely not on at all. and it creates, you listen to something like Chopin played in that way, it creates a really fascinating sound. I'm not suggesting that it's trying to recreate the sound that Chopin would have made, because we can't do that. Nobody
No,
can
no, no.
do that.
Mm.
But it's just a more, I think, a more flexible, more liberated way of playing. And I think that, you know, a lot of the difficulties that you mentioned, in addition to the image and sort of the fact that everything is so visual now, is also that there are just so many recordings which are held
Mm.
up as benchmarks, and um, they are often very, however wonderful they are, many are also feel very standard, if that makes sense.
Mm.
You know, it's
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
you know, we will always play Debussy in this way, we will always play Bach or Beethoven in this way. And I think this goes back to perhaps one of our earlier conversations about the notion of the right way. And I
Mm.
feel that now musicians are more constrained actually than they were, say, 50 or 100 years ago, which is a great pity. And I also think that, you know, there's a whole lot more commentary and criticism online and elsewhere, where, you know, the right way to play this repertoire is constantly being held up,
Mm.
as an example, and particularly young pianists, I think, struggle to find their own voice, for fear of, you know, not getting the bookings, not getting the attention, because they're different, they're a bit maverick.
Mm.
There aren't that many maverick pianists alive today, I'd say. I mean, the one that comes straight to my mind is Ivo Pogorelic,
Mm.
who has, I mean, increasingly in performance is more and more eccentric, but you listen to his recordings, I mean, for example, his Scarlatti is absolutely magical.
Mm.
Um, but he's very quirky on stage,
Mm.
which for some is wonderful, and for others is, you know, irritating, because it doesn't fit into the norm, the
Yeah.
sort of narrow standards of how performance and playing of this repertoire should take place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you made a very good point. I think in the case of Pogorelic, I would like to say that he takes more risk
Mm,
than a pianist like Brendel or Schiff, you
mm,
know. And certainly in his earlier recording, you know, a lot of those risks were, I maybe this is not a good term, but they were well calculated. They were, you know, sort of they're very well designed, that it does come across. But I am just not convinced in his recent recordings, you know, that the risk that he's taking, or the musical decisions that he's making in his interpretations, are working as well as they are in during the early recordings. But that's just my opinion, and I'm always in the sense that I'm always a pianist, or someone who prefers to go and hear a pianist who can play, who has magical moments in his performances. But then there's always a risk that on his day he's not so good, as opposed to go and hear a pianist who plays a very solid, say 85%. You know, I tend to, you know, prefer to go and hear pianists who can play. Sometimes I hear 99, but then, you know, at the same time they can hear a 45. But then the problem is to sit through the 45%. You
yeah.
know?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's a there's a real balance to be struck, isn't there, between taking a
Yes.
and not taking a risk. I actually think that the best risk takers are the ones that know the score, know the music intimately. It gives them the freedom to step outside of those boundaries.
Without doubt.
Yeah.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and as I like, just, you know, to go back to the pianists of another age, they did have that freedom, I think, because they weren't bound by the so many conventions of performance.
Yeah,
And
I think, yeah.
yeah,
Sorry, Van. I think it's that, and I think it's also that there is a real sense of, because there is no social media and or whatever, and they don't feel like the whole world's, you know, it's constantly looking at them every minute. You know, it's almost like they, you know, they have the guts to say, this is what I want to say in the music that I play. And, if you don't like it, so what? I don't need to reaffirm, the affirmation that unless I get, sort of 16,000 views on my, 10-second video within the first week, then I'm doing something right. They don't care about that. Or
Yeah,
they don't care how their hair looks, or, what they look like in a gym, for example,
yeah.
that's
I think our image driven times now have a lot to answer for. Um, I also feel that I'm sorry, I've lost my thread. That the pianists of the earlier age, I think there were fewer of them, weren't there? I think the
Hmm.
world was not as competitive as it is now.
No,
Um,
no.
so and again so there was more freedom in that respect too. That one wasn't up against so many other people in order to carve a career. Um,
Mm.
and I think that must make a difference too. Um, what do you feel that we can take as pianists? What do you feel we can take from exploring the recordings of some of the greats of the past?
Um, for me, the biggest biggest lesson I've learned from listening to pianists such as Radelupu and Rubinstein, Aral, those guys, like I mentioned before at the start of our podcast, is this unwavering sense of integrity to the music. And coupled with that, the wonderful sense of musical direction. They know exactly where the music's going and how to shape the rubato or design the rubato in the sense that it makes sense
Mm,
towards the climaxes, and then go away towards climaxes and away from the climaxes. And of course, someone like Radulupu, who's outstanding when it comes to shaping of the musical phrases, and also the layering of the colors. Someone like Horowitz, it's also like a pioneer, especially when he comes to playing concertis, like us. And I don't mean Mozart concertis, I'm not too fond of those. I mean the Rachmaninoff concertis, like the third concertos, that sort of stuff. But that's again my opinion. Again, I mean the technique is taken for granted. You look at someone like Georges Ballet, who plays some of the hardest repertoire, but it's not the fact that he plays them at breakneck speed. He plays them very, very musically.
mm,
Despite the fact that I mean he. Regardless of what he comes across on his interview, I mean, I actually enjoy his playing very, very much. And whereas you look at someone like Rudolf Zirkin, who's also one of my favorite pianists. Now, I know not a lot of people like Zirkin, but I don't agree with everything he does. But I find it extraordinary that every time when he plays the piano, he seems to have an incredible connection with the music that he plays. Now, it's very difficult to watch sometimes. He's the opposite to someone like Lang Lang. Now, when Lang Lang comes on stage, everything, and I think that's one of the selling points of Lang Lang's performances, because when Lang Lang plays, everything looks so facile and looks so easy, and he looks like he's having a good time. Now, the opposite comes with Zirkin. When he gets on stage, he looks very uncomfortable. He's partially nervous. And, when he, plays the music, especially Beethoven, he gets locked into this titanic struggle of life and death with the characters that he's interpreting. But he's an extraordinary musician to watch because he has such a personality, and he's so convinced with what he wants to say about the music that he ends up convincing you,
mm.
you know. And it's the same with someone like Lazar Berman, I guess, But then that's again just my opinion.
Oh well, I discovered Lazar Berman's recordings of the Liszt Années when I was first learning the Petrarch sonnets from that suite, and I think they're wonderful performances. It's hard to explain why, actually. And for me, the fact that one can't explain why certain performances are so wonderful is a sign of how remarkable they are. You
Yeah.
literally are lost for words by the beauty of the sound, or the flow of the phrasing, and as you said, rubato. I think that I sense there's more rubato and more I hesitate to use the word intelligent rubato, but I think you know what I mean. You know, I often
Tasteful.
tasteful rubato. That's sounding like a music critic there. But natural rubato,
Natural. I think natural.
I think
I think.
rubato is one of the hardest things to get right.
Mm,
Talking about right and wrong, and as we have done in previous conversations. And I think that I mean, I remember trying to teach it, and it's one of the most difficult things to explain to students, you know, especially early and intermediate students.
mm.
Um, uh, and I do think that these earlier recordings we hear a real naturalness and a much greater flexibility of tempo as well. Again, it's
Yeah, without doubt.
I
Yeah.
think it's comes from this you know, relatively few recordings to measure one's playing
Mm,
against, or for
mm,
listeners to measure different performances against
mm.
one another. And therefore there is that freedom. It's
Yeah.
very interesting. The other thing that I found interesting when I was studying the Schubert D959 for my last diploma, and I listened to a range of recordings from very early Cherkassy to you know, contemporary pianists. And Cherkassy's was one of my favorites because there was such simplicity in his expression. You know, and you know, as you know, Schubert is I'm very, very fond of his music, his piano music, but there's an awful lot of psychobabble associated with him, and a lot of pianists who play on that. Um, and you know, I feel that we don't have enough information about Schubert's life to make those assumptions about certain
Mm,
pieces and movements of sonatas and whatever. And so Cherkassy just gives you the music. And that's not to say it's boring, it isn't at all, but he there is that cliched allowing the music to speak, but that is literally
yes.
what he's
Yes.
doing. There's no unnecessary additions to it, and yet it's very, very beautiful, very simple playing. So you really appreciate all the details that Schubert brings to the music. I think that some of these things can be obscured in performance when the performer puts too much of their own personality,
Yeah.
or
It's always a balance between the two.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I think someone who we should talk about because he caught so much controversy, of course, is Glenn Gould. Uh, and you know,
Yes.
he totally is a Marmite pianist, is he not? That, you know, you either love what he does or you hate it. I
Mm,
think that there are pretty extreme points of view with regard to him, but as I've got older and I've listened to more recordings and I've played more music myself, my kind of adulation of Gould has rather subsided, but I still think he's very interesting. And
mm,
I think that perhaps not unlike someone like Pogorelic, he decided from an early stage that he was going to be a maverick. I mean, he
mm,
is a noted eccentric, and
mm,
that's fine because people like that are interesting.
mm,
And you know, much of what he did goes really against the grain of kind of received wisdom about certain repertoire composers and ways of playing their music. I mean, you know, Bach is the obvious example, um, but I think he brings very many interesting things. I think it's worth exploring his recordings, not just to hear him humming along and
mm,
muttering, but the sound he creates, I think, is very interesting. It's this wonderful resonance, even when playing in a détaché style, for example. Uh,
mm,
and I think, you know, there's some real beauty in his playing, and also that, you know, people forget that he didn't just play Bach. He played actually quite a wide repertoire, and I think it's you know, it's worth exploring some of his other recordings of other composers to learn more about you know, different. It offers it offers the listener and the player an alternative view, shall we say? And I'm all for
I
alternative views,
I agree with
just
that.
in
No,
music.
I agree with you. I just saw the timer popped up. So I think that maybe our next podcast will have to be about Glenn Gould, from the start, that sort of stuff. Look, I agree with a lot of what you say, but then, I'm a little reluctant to go into my own opinions here because I think that we'll just go past time here. But look, certainly when it comes to the separation of textures and bringing out musical line, he is second to none, and articulation as well, that sort of stuff. Among some of the other stuff that he does might not be as agreeable or what the music wants to do, but then I suspect that links in with who he is as a person and the reason for him to play the piano. I mean, if you just decide that you're going to play the piano to annoy everyone or for whatever reasons, then you go ahead and play the piano to annoy everyone. That doesn't. But having said that, that's not to say that I don't have admiration for what he's done and what he's contributed to the classical music. Do I really want to know him as a person? Judging from the accounts from his friends, not really, because I don't feel like being phone up at 11 o'clock at night and being sing opera too, and that sort of stuff. But but certainly, yes, a very interesting person. So I think perhaps we have to start our next podcast talking about Glenn Gould and some of his famous
Yeah.
recordings, like the
Yeah.
Bach Goldberg variations, of course, which there are 3 recordings. And
Yeah.
in my opinion, the second recording, the one live from Vienna, is the best one of the lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. Another great pianist of the past who I have huge admiration for is Richter. And I think there's several reasons why with him. I mean, I've read his memoirs, which are very interesting, and I I think he was probably not unlike Liszt, a generous musician who supported other musicians. He went to many concerts given by other people, and he documents his visits to these concerts in his diaries and notebooks, and makes very detailed notes. Not always complimentary, but I think that going and supporting friends and colleagues and going to hear other musicians playing is what musicians should be doing. And
Yes, I think so.
I
I agree. To
really
have a
don't
sense of
think they
community.
do enough of it. Yeah, exactly. To foster a sense of community. I think another thing to admire in him is that he really would play anything. An enormous repertoire, kind of fearlessness about playing such a wide range of music. And an honesty as well, as obviously as he got older and his hearing started to fail him, which is why he started to play with the score.
Yes.
And also, there's some lovely things that for me, I think are interesting points. Like, he used to play in almost complete darkness with just a light illuminating the music desk.
Yeah.
And when asked why he did that, he says, "Well, nobody wants to see me working." And that is so different actually to what we were saying earlier about the visual aspect of concerts now, where the stage lights are on. You're encouraged to, especially if you're a female performer, to be flamboyant in your dress, eye-catching.
You're being very polite, friend.
I've written about this actually, image in classical music today. I'll put it up on my blog soon. I mean, he's at the other extreme, playing in almost complete darkness, so that one's ears are simply tuned to the music, not watching the pianist's expression, whether they're gurning or grinning. And I kind of like that. I would personally like to go to concerts in the dark. I think it encourages a different listening experience as well.
No, definitely. Right. Are we going to assign stuff to what room 101, Fran?
Oh yes, we should do. I didn't think we did that in our last one.
I
Well,
think we did, but I can't remember what we did. I just have to go back.
It's hard. Actually, this is a really hard one because there's so much great stuff there.
Yeah.
I think perhaps for me, I would consign to room 101 a lack of open-mindedness about exploring recordings. There are some people who are very fussy about the way things are recorded, for example, sort of hi-fi nerds, as it were. And so it doesn't matter if it's an old recording, perhaps a remaster of a very early recording, and there are organizations and people that are doing that, because there's something quite special actually about a crackly old recording,
Oh yeah.
a mono recording. It also reminds us actually that the technology was different, but it was still able to capture the essence of these people. And I think so. I think one should always listen with an open mind. So I'm banishing a closed mind with regard to exploring early recordings to Room
No,
101.
no, no. I think that's a good point, and I believe that you know, for me, my Room 101 would be that you know, there's certain people tend to get very worked up and stay very loyal to their choice of pianists. You know, some people might say, oh, you know, like Radu Lupu is the greatest pianist. Some people will no, it's actually RL, someone's Richter. No, they actually it's Glenn Gould and that sort of stuff. You know, they're all great. They all bring something to the you know to the music, and it's all very interesting to listen to them. Like you say, listen with an open mind. You know, you don't just because I like Richter playing doesn't mean that I like everything he plays. I'm a big Horowitz fan, but there's things that Horowitz play absolutely appallingly, you know, that sort of stuff. I mean, I love Radu Lupu, but then again, some of the stuff that he does is less than agreeable, you know.
Yeah,
But that's, you know, they're all human beings at the end of the day. I mean, when you
yeah.
like someone, it doesn't mean that you have to like everything they do, you know. That's my opinion.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And I think also that, I mean, I have favorite pianists for certain composers.
Mm.
Um, and
Mm.
and now and then you come across something. You may have read my review. I've just recently reviewed a new release from an American pianist where he does some very interesting things with Debussy's Image,
Mm.
which I think a lot of people will be somewhat resistant to, shall we say. But it's interesting, and that's for me is what listening with an open mind is to find things that are interesting within these recordings. It's not necessarily,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily the new way to play Debussy, but it's his way, it's his take on it, and the guy does a lot of research and study, and also plays a lot of contemporary repertoire, which I think is reflected in the sound he creates. It's very interesting, and I was happy to have an opportunity to hear it. It made me
Excellent.
hear Debussy in a different way, and that is a good thing. Again, it's challenging our sort of normal assumptions about this music and the composers. Anything that does that, I think, is also good for us as musicians.
I think so, but I think one has to be careful. Just looking at the clock, that there is a difference between doing something that's interesting but still within the scope of what you think the composer won,
Yeah.
or just being absolutely completely bizarre, like the first movement of Glenn Gould's Mozart Sonata in A major, you know, the famous one, or as I see on YouTube sometimes, you know, I'm not going to give these guys any like time of the day because I don't think they deserve it. But I'm just going to quickly mention that some people decide that the new way of playing the piano is to play everything quarter speed because all our performances are too fast, you know. So there is a difference between that and being completely bizarre, I guess, you know.
I agree. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's a good note on which to close, and that we're just about to be out of time. So thank you.
Yeah,
That was a very enjoyable conversation, Michael, and I'll put some links up with the podcast so that people can explore some further listening.
sure,
Great.
sure.
Okay, until
Great.
next time.
Until next time. Okay, cheers, Fran. Okay,
Bye.
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 Bye.